Hello and welcome to the PHFA Certificate in Elder Service Coordination Program. Today's topic is interventions for elders. These webinars, in conjunction with specified sessions at the PHFA Housing Services Conference, will enable you to be eligible to receive a Certificate in Elder Service Coordination, which will be issued in partnership with PHFA and the California University Rural Communities Institute. Please feel free to participate in the webinar today, and the presenter's contact information will be provided at the end of the presentation. Our presenter this morning is Dr. Janet Ann Melnick. Dr. Melnick holds a PhD in Human Development with a specialization in social work. Prior to working on her doctorate, she was in clinical practice and administration in local agencies that specialize in work with the elderly for over 15 years. Dr. Melnick was the original supervisor of the Protective Service Unit for the Lackawanna County Area Agency on Aging. After leaving the AAA, Dr. Melnick was the Director of Rehabilitation Services for Telespond Senior Services. In that capacity, she was responsible for the administration of 2 adult day services facilities, a coordinated outpatient facility, in-home respite services, and family caregiver services. Dr. Melnick was one of the original grantees for Robert Wood Johnson Dementia Care and Respite Services Project. After the end of that grant demonstration project, she was invited to become a consultant for the RWJ Foundation Partners in Caregiving Program, which funded and mentored adult daycare programs across the country. Dr. Melnick was the assistant coordinator of the social work field program at Marywood University prior to moving to Penn State. She has been a faculty member in Human Development and Family Studies at the Pennsylvania State University, Worthington-Scranton since 2000. She is a senior instructor and also the program coordinator and field coordinator for the HDFS and psychology programs on the Worthington-Scranton campus. Her primary teaching responsibility is in the gerontology and the internship components of the program. Dr. Melnick's research has been predominantly in the area of rural home and community-based services for the elderly. She has been the primary investigator for 2 grants from the Center for Rural PA in this area of research. So Dr. Melnick, good morning, and thank you for presenting.
Thank you. Everybody can hear me, I hope. Alicia?
Yes, it sounds very good.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Hopefully we won't have any technical issues. Everybody, fingers and toes crossed. But Alicia will let me know. Last time I was moving the slides along, but it got stuck. So hopefully that won't happen again, but we'll just do the best that we can should that happen. So good morning. So we're going to talk about interventions in aging services. Last time we talked about assessment, and these all go hand in hand. Our final session, I'll try to wrap everything up and pull everything together in May. And doesn't May sound nice about now? So our session goals for today, learning about what the helping process is, being able to explain the roles of what an interventionalist or a change agent and what they do, understanding the key elements to ethical decision making, and increasing awareness of formal and informal resources and supports to enhance informed decision-making. So today I'm going to touch a little bit about AAA services and what the Department of Aging offers, and probably in the last session we'll go into that a little bit more deeply. So let's get started. And as Alicia says, I do want this to be interactive, so we're going to talk about the helping process. So your first question today is, what does the helping process mean to you?
So while they're thinking about the question, I'm going to put my spin on what I believe the helping process means to me. Being in the fields that everyone is, helping process to me means that you're maybe not necessarily providing the actual service to them, but you are finding out information to be able to present it and maybe be that bridge to help that person because our goal in affordable housing or any kind of housing really, is to allow a person to stay in their homes for as long as possible.
Right.
So one of our participants says it means to them finding ways to offer support, information, connections for a person who expresses a need. I think that is very well stated.
I think that's very well stated. That's kind of it in a nutshell, and we'll be talking about the helping process and how you do it and what that means. So the second question, to move things along, and probably this is probably the crux of the matter for everyone, is what do you see as your role in this process?
Well, as I said, you know, working with service coordinators and property managers, I see the role, which may be different than what they see it, but I kind of see them as the bridge.
Okay, as a bridge.
They might have, you know, other ideas, or maybe they can expand on it.
Yeah, I mean, being a bridge is certainly probably the main thing.
Right. So one of our participants says that, this was an answer from question 1. They said finding out what the tenant needs and assisting them in finding ways, and absolutely, I have to agree with that.
And that's going to be a real component. It's needs, and also we'll talk a little bit in a minute about what they want too.
Oh, and you know what? This is a perfect answer here to someone, what they see as their role. They see the role as a facilitator and also as an advocate for a resident. And so that's different from like my position, you know, versus theirs. And another person says as an advocate to find the resources they need to remain independent. So that really is the theme, is advocacy.
Right, and I think those are action words. So where you described it, Alicia, as being a bridge, being an advocate means that you're really taking an active role in helping your residents find the services that they probably need. Great. 2 more questions here. What are the positive outcomes of this type of interaction? So what I'm asking here is, what positive outcomes would you get as a manager working with your residents by being an advocate and being a bridge for them?
Oh, well, someone just said they can protect their residents from scams.
Okay, they can protect them from scams.
And to save them money.
Save them money, okay. But I want you to think about the relationship itself. And I'll put up the last question, and maybe that will be easier than, and I'm also getting so happy residents and remaining independent. Happy residents is good. It's like, you know, happy wife, happy life kind of thing. So happy residents certainly makes your job easier. But there's positive things to being part of the helping process, and there's also potential hazards. So any other, you know, what might be some hazards of getting involved with your residents in the helping process here? Any thoughts to that?
Liability.
Liability?
I agree with, yes. And I guess from like a personal standpoint is, unfortunately, some of our service coordinators, they put so much into it that they actually become fatigued and worn out. Emotional boundaries, exactly. Other people are, one of our participants says, other people don't always recognize the right to make bad decisions. Other staff and residents may feel they belong in a nursing home.
Right. That's a big one. That is a big one. And again, in a second, we're going to talk about some of that. But being able to accept when someone makes a bad decision.
Right. And one last one was that you may get backlash from family members.
Right.
Because they trust the service coordinator or the property manager more than they actually trust their family.
Right. Okay. So that we can see, and actually you were able to identify a lot more potential hazards than maybe potential benefits too. So let's talk a little bit more about it. Okay, so I'm moving on here, and I'll keep doing that, Alicia, so you know I'm moving the slide along, so in case we have any problems. So let me just talk about what the helping process is. From a professional standpoint, there's really two simple phases to a helping process. It's building the relationship and trying to facilitate a positive action. What we talk about when we mean process is the sequence of events and their meanings to the clients. So when we look at the helping process, it's not just usually a one-time thing. It is building that relationship over time, building trust with our clients and residents, and then trying to help them move forward in a positive way. Okay. So there's different stages to the helping process. The first stage is developing that helping relationship. If people do not trust you, they are not going to listen to you. So you think about in your own life, who do you take advice from? Usually it's trusted family, people and friends, people you've known a long time, people who have given you maybe advice in the past that has turned out to be good advice and not necessarily bad advice. So even in our professional relationships, it's really developing trust. Why would anybody trust someone and listen to them if they haven't developed that trust, if they haven't been in the relationship where they understand that the person is there to help them and not to hurt them in any way? So we talk about this includes establishing a genuine relationship, and that word genuine I can't really overemphasize too much. People will know if you are not genuine. Genuine relationships based on trust by treating each case and client as unique, suspending critical judgment and typical solutions in the box approach, listening, learning, and respect. The client owns both the problem and the solution, and we are here to help them in their journey. And that's a profound statement and very hard for you folks in your roles, for professional social workers, other clinicians, to understand that the client owns their own problem and the solution, and they have the choice of what they do to alleviate that problem or not. The second part and stage is helping clients understand the problem situation. For a lot of clients, what you see as a problem may not be what they see as a problem. I do an exercise with my students when they're in internship and they have to do what's called process recordings. And part of that is identifying what the agency wants for the client, but then also identifying what the client wants. And it's really hard for students in the beginning to look at this and say, well, what the client wants is what the agency wants. And oftentimes, even if the clients are voluntary clients actively seeking services, it doesn't mean that they are identifying the problem in the same way or want the same solution. So here we have to sometimes help people understand that, number one, there is a problem and that we want to be able to help them to do something about it. But if they don't recognize there's a problem, then there's no need for them, from their point of view, to do anything about it.
With this kind of, because unfortunately, a lot of our properties are actually dealing with a hoarding issue. So,
yeah.
You know, management sees a hoarding issue, and unfortunately, the resident doesn't see a hoarding issue. They simply see, you know, all of their things.
Right.
So would that be a classic example of?
Absolutely. That's a great example of what a problem that you all would see as a problem, and someone who has a hoarding problem, they need all that stuff. They need all those papers and those bottle caps and everything else. They need that, and that's the hard part, is getting clients to see that this is a problem for them. You know, hoarding behaviors is part of OCD, and it usually needs medication to help treat with that as well, but that's a really good example of how the client would not see initially that there's a problem at all. And sometimes it has to get to a crisis point for clients to realize that there is a problem, and sometimes for family members too. And in your case, it might be eviction. in a situation where it was hoarding, for someone to realize, hey, this is really a problem. In other cases, even with family members, we can deny a lot, especially if there's dementia, that there's a problem until something catastrophic happens. They leave the pot of water on the stove and it boils out, starts a fire. They go out in the middle of the winter in their pajamas, that kind of thing. You know, we want to maintain status quo, and it's hard sometimes for everyone to recognize that there's a problem that exists. So that's a really good example. Stage 3 is helping clients identify a preferred scenario and establish change goals. So we want to talk about developing a range of different scenarios and choosing what goals to pursue. If you give clients, and I think that we do this with the elderly a lot because many times we treat them like children, is we say, you must do X. And sometimes there's really a broader range of options for the client. So it's really you as the helping agent being able to identify what are the possible solutions to a problem and being able to help the client work through one that they're comfortable with. So sometimes it's not always black and white. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. And it's helping the client and someone else helping maybe staff to realize that there's a range of options there. The 4th stage is to help the clients plan and take action. So supporting a highly adaptable and a creative approach based on structured step-by-step plan, using well-proven methods, helping to measure and gather feedback, and to continually adjust plan and measure. So it's really here we're helping the client focus so that they can take action. And this kind of comes down to one word in terms of empowerment. We empower clients. Many times our clients feel helpless. They don't know what to do. So sometimes it's just us saying, here's what we're going to plan together. Here's the steps that you need to take, and I will help you take those steps. But you empower clients to make that change. And we always want to be able to do that with our elderly clients because in many cases they do not have a lot of options, and caregivers, family members might be taking away those options from them. Okay, moving on. We want to consolidate the change, so finding ways to anchor the changes, reminding and rewarding new ways. We want to give feedback. People, when they change, if they make a change, it doesn't mean that change is going to stay forever. It's constant positive feedback. It's checking in with people. So that's what it means for the helper in this case. Great, we made, Mrs. Smith, we made this change. You were able to get these services. It doesn't mean that Mrs. Smith is going to keep those services in the house. And this is what's so frustrating for family members and for practitioners is we think we do all this great work, we get all these services in, and then the resident, the client turns around and says, I don't want that anymore. And that's hard because we have to accept that, at least initially, but try to find out maybe what the problem is. A good example of this is getting services in the home like personal care services. From the outside, it seems like a no-brainer kind of thing. This person can't bathe themselves anymore. It's going to be a fall risk. Why wouldn't anybody want someone coming in to help them? And there's a lot of reasons. Privacy issues, fear of people coming into your home that you don't know. And that actually is a really, legitimate fear about taking things, not being comfortable. I mean, we have to look at it from the person's perspective. Something like personal care is a very intimate kind of service. And it might be, someone told you have to have someone come in and help you take a bath. You might say, no, I don't. I see one coming up, denial. Absolutely, denial may be part of it, but again, honoring where that client is at and helping them work through the feelings, not just saying, oh, you're not really realizing what reality is. It may truly be denial, but it's also respecting their feelings. And people are very private.
I've also, when I was a service coordinator, and I had a resident who, had home health agency, and then all of a sudden they wanted to stop. and, you know, maybe they went through all the things, but, you know, sometimes it's simple as maybe the caregiver that used to come in doesn't, and there's a personality conflict. So it's not really that they don't want services, it's maybe, you know, they don't have that relationship, or they simply just don't like the person, you know, and then you know, you have to have the conversation. They still want the services, but maybe they need to change agencies, or the agency that they have needs to send a different person. You know, maybe it was a male versus a female, you know, and those things make a difference too.
Absolutely. Very good point. And again, I think with the elderly, if it was any other person, we'd say, why don't you want to have the service? And if they said, I don't like that person, we would validate that. Sometimes with the elderly, we tend to ignore that, though. Oh, they're fine. You know, we tend to not value what that elderly person is saying about the person coming in to their home to provide caregiving services. So we have to listen. We have to really listen to what the client is saying. But it's a really good point, Alicia. And you know,
one of our participants says to focus on the positive outcomes.
Yes,
you know,
focus
instead of on what it is that they're losing. You know, focus on maybe the positive aspect. You know, I'm a person who is a half full. My glass is half full. Technically, it's half empty, but I prefer to think of it as half full, and so I like to think of the positive. So yeah, sometimes, you know, it's not that you want to sugarcoat it, that there aren't any maybe possible negatives, but, you know, try to encourage and focus on the positives.
Yeah, focusing on the positives. Although when sometimes people, you have to be careful there, because you have to not run roughshod over their feelings. So focus on the positives, but don't try to deny what that person is feeling. Does that make sense? I hope it's acknowledging their concerns, and not, because I've seen it so many times, you know, family members like, oh, Mom, you know, you got to focus on this, and this is going to be helpful for you, and no one really listens to what the elderly person is saying. So I think there has to be a good balance there. Finally, withdrawing from the helping relationship. I mean, what we try to do in the business, no matter what any kind of helper, is we try to put ourselves out of business. Probably, you know, helping professions are the only ones that try to do that. We try to have the person be independent as possible. So ensuring, you know, that they can go on and make their decisions, and with maybe just a little help from us. But that we give them the tools to help them with whatever challenges are coming up ahead. Now, with the elderly, it's a little bit different than working with other adult clients, because the elderly might continue to decompensate as they get older. So we may never fully withdraw from that helping relationship, but we certainly want to, again, empower people to make their own decisions and to be as independent as we possibly can make them. So this is the classic social work joke, I guess, when we talk about being agents of change. How many social workers does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, but the light bulb has to want to change. So I thought I'd add that in there because, and it's true. I mean, it's funny, but it's also true. You cannot make people change if they have no desire to be able to do that. But let's talk about what it means to be a change agent. So I have some questions here for you, and let's brainstorm. So what do you think it means to be an agent of change?
So I'm going to draw on my experience as a service coordinator, and I'm still going to go back. I was, you know, the person that they came to because they needed service, and so I was the facilitator. Well, I'm going to go back to I was the bridge. That's how I looked at myself.
Mm-hmm.
To be able, you know, to connect, to let someone be able to make that change.
Okay, so being the bridge again, letting them, and maybe it's part of that too is seeding the ground so that they can make changes. So being that bridge, it might be helping to plant ideas with the client, helping to gain services so that there can be change. Okay.
Right, and part of what our properties also do is like they'll bring in presenters that will give them information that maybe they don't need now, but at some point they might need that information in order to make the change. So, like you said, it's kind of like planting the ground. So some of our participants says helping the resident understand and be aware of their options. And always staying neutral, which sometimes is very hard to do.
It's very hard, and sometimes I don't think your role allows you to do that, especially if, in a hoarding situation, or if the apartment is not being kept up to standards. You have a specific role that you need to play as a manager, and so sometimes you can't be always neutral. It's good when you can be, but sometimes you can't be.
Right, and another person said it means building strong relationships and building this trust with their residents, and also being and acknowledge different cultures. Sometimes that really does play a big role.
Absolutely. If you don't understand the person's culture, and one of the best ways to ask, one of the best ways to find out about a person's culture is just to ask them. But certain cultures are going to be very different from our dominant culture, and a lot of times we don't understand why people make the choices that they do, but it's based upon that culture. For instance, in many Asian cultures, it's not about the individual, it's about family. So people make decisions not based as we do in Western culture on what's good for me, it's what's good for my family, and that doesn't just mean the nuclear family, that means a large extended family too. So great. So 2 other questions here. How do you know that you're acting in the client's best interest and not imposing your will on them? And then how do you accept when a client refuses to change or make the changes you suggest? These are 2 very hard ones.
I'm gonna, my experience is sometimes I actually would write down a list. Like I would, brainstorm so that I kind of took myself out of the equation. So you deal with, facts versus what it is that you think that they actually should be doing, and that comes down to also being able to accept if they make a bad choice, and maybe they're going to pick a choice that's not even, on what you think is a good answer,
Right. Yeah, and I think I saw one that came up.
With them.
Yeah. Respecting their choices, and that you have to do that, but I think it's very hard to respect someone's choices when you know that they're going to be heading down, or at least what you feel is the wrong path for them. So this is
one of our participants says, know that you have given them all the information available. That you don't hold something back because you don't want them to make that particular decision. So
yes.
I have to agree that, if you give them all the facts and then you let them make the decision, not kind of like hiding an option that you don't think is the best answer, you're just not going to tell them so that they don't know.
Right. Right. I think that's really, that's a good one. We're human, and in a helping relationship, you must give them all the options, and then let them choose. And maybe, as you said, Alicia, before, they're going to choose something that's not even in the ones that you've given them. I think Deanna thinks, believe in time that they'll come around, and that may be true, but some people do not do that. When I did adult protective services, this was probably one of the biggest issues, and it was the problem that I had was getting other professionals to understand that unless a client was incompetent, and unless they were breaking the law or housing regulations in some way, they had the right to make bad decisions. But that's very hard for people to understand. Again, with the elderly, I think we go back to treating them like we would treat children who do not have that choice. We tend, especially when there's, as they get into very old age, even if there's no cognitive impairment, we see them as people who we need to take care of, and that's great. But when you start making the choices and not accepting the choices that they make, and again, given that they don't have any cognitive impairment, and that they also are not breaking any laws, and being able to walk away from that with the idea, I'll check in on you and we'll see how it goes, I think that's one of the hardest things, and it's hard to get other people to really accept that. And I saw one flash up giving them the pros and cons, and sometimes that's all you can do is give them what choices, okay? And there's another comment coming up, Alicia, I can only see part of it.
It says that we need to understand that older folks are adults and that we need to speak with them with respect and also respect for their wisdom.
Right, and that's what I'm saying, and that's, again, very, very, very hard sometimes for us to do, but sometimes it's not us, it's everybody around them. And sometimes you even have to work with family members who think they know what's best for mom or dad, or grandma or grandpa, when grandma or grandpa is not making the same decisions that they want them to make. Okay, great. What we try to do is also to get people to make changes that at least part of them resist. That's part of being a change agent, and always working in the best interest of the client. Compassion. You've got to start with a place of empathy, and empathy is not sympathy. So we don't want people, if you're sympathetic with someone and they're crying, you may cry as well. That's not what we want when we're in a helping relationship. But we do want to really try to get in our heads to the point where we can understand what that person is feeling and thinking. And it can be very different from the place that we are at. Think of an argument you have with your spouse or significant other. And if two people are yelling at each other, no one's really trying to understand the point of view of that other person. And it's kind of the same in a helping relationship. If we have it in our mindset that we're the professional, we know what's best, we're not listening and we're not empathizing with what may be the real underlying issues that stop someone from making a change. Caring. There's a difference between caring about and caring for. Caring about, you have feelings that you want to do something. Caring for is actually doing something to help another person. And in our role as professionals, we may take on, we always care about the person. Sometimes we help care for that person. Sometimes we do not take on that caring for role because if they can still do for themselves, we want to empower them to be able to do that. So it's really understanding your role and where you're coming from. Sometimes we get to the point where, we work with people because we love people, we want to do the best that we can for them, but you have to be careful that you are not doing for someone when they can actually do for themselves. And then wisdom, understanding, a regard for the truth, and ability to make sound judgments. And that's what we have to develop in ourselves, is being able to listen to clients, be empathetic with them, and then help them to make some sound judgments. We want to help and enable people to work effectively as they plan, implement, and experience change, and increasing people's ability to manage future changes. And the competencies required here, you really have to be knowledgeable about what the alternatives are and how to access services. And I don't care how many years you've been in the business, services change, the way services are managed change. We always have to continually educate ourselves. And sometimes we have to tell people, I don't know what the answer is to that question, but I will get back to you when I find out what the answer is. So
we kind of have a saying And it's the saying goes, you don't have to know it all, you just have to know who to call.
Right, that's a good one. I like that. I
Yes,
like that, yeah.
so a lot of people will come to me with questions, and probably about 80% of them I know the answer. But if I don't know the answer, I'll tell you I don't know the answer. But chances are, I might know a person who does, or that person knows somebody who does. At some point, I will get you the answer that you need, but there's no way that one person, can know absolutely, all the services or all the programs that are out there. And so it is about networking.
Yeah, you're right, and it's about knowing who to call. And I think as helping professionals, especially when we're just getting started, a lot of times I think we put too much pressure on ourselves, that we feel like we have to have all the answers, we have to know everything, or somehow we're lacking. And that's not true. And that's what I try to always tell my students. And I've been in the business a long time, but were I to go back into clinical practice right now, I'd have another learning curve to really understand what services are out there and how best to help clients. So we're constantly learning. And you can't get to the point where you feel like you know everything, because then it will change on you and you will find things that you don't know. Right? So your life does not get better by chance, it gets better by change. And a profound statement, but we as human beings are afraid of change in many ways. So let me just ask another question here. Why do you think that clients, residents might be afraid of change?
One of the reasons that I think that they are is because it has always worked and they don't see any reason.
Right.
People are saying fear of the unknown. Very, very true.
Right.
Where they get used to their routines and lifestyles, and no one likes change because it brings forward the unknown. They're comfortable with what they know, and they're afraid of losing control. I think that's a very, very good point.
That is, and that's a, if we are afraid of losing control as non-elderly folks, imagine what it's like when you are losing control. When people, even when they move into housing, someone has, or they've realized that they can't maintain in their home anymore. That's a scary proposition. And what I always try to do when I'm working with clients is try to really tune in to what they may be afraid of. And that losing control, I got another one, 60 years of living one way, and then having to change, or big change, very uncomfortable for us. And human beings do not like change for the most part. Change can be good.
Comment. There's a comment that says people don't like change for the sake of change. They have to understand why the change is required or helpful.
Right.
You can't just say, you need to, because, and it means, change means adjustment to what you see as normal.
Right. Right. And that's so true, that you can't just make people change because you think that the change is going to be good. Here, change, and then I'm going to go away. It's a very frightening proposition. And elderly folks have gone through so many losses, usually by this point. It may be loss of a spouse or significant other, or adult children, friends, relatives, loss of being independent at home. One of the big things that they lose and afraid of is not being able to drive anymore. Think about how independent we are in this country. When you're 16 years old and you get your driver's license, suddenly you're free, and you've been driving for a long time. Well, maybe they've lost and can no longer drive. So for the elderly, especially when we get into old age, there has already been a series of losses that have involved change, and none of them probably have been good changes, or at least how the person may view it as good change. So another possibility of change comes along, and wow, they may be resistive to making yet another change. Okay, so moving along here. So question is, what do you think you must possess? What qualities in yourself to be an effective agent of change?
Empathy.
Yep, empathy,
A
absolutely.
good listener, compassion.
Right? So what does it mean, people are saying good listening skills. What does it mean to be a good listener?
I think for me, being a good listener means that you actually let them speak.
Right, that's
You're
the first part.
hearing what it is that they're saying, and not constantly interjecting because you have an opinion to do it.
Yeah, if you just listen to people's conversations, just normal everyday conversations, we talk over one another in many cases because we're so anxious to get in on the conversation, to say our opinion, to show the other person that we know where they're coming from. We just go out and listen to normal everyday conversations. Sometimes the best thing that you can do as a professional is just to shut up and open up your ears and really try to understand what they're talking about. No two people look at a situation the same way, so you really have to understand what the person is saying from their perspective. There's a therapy called narrative therapy that I talk about with my students that I practice from, and it's really understanding the narrative or what a situation means to a person. Okay, so I also see some other things coming up.
Yeah, some of and I want to share this is to hear where the other person's coming from, which is which you touched on. Hear and acknowledge them. Don't assume. You need to ask. There is that saying, assuming makes out of you and me, because you already have a preset idea. Maybe you didn't really listen to what it was. Active listening is validating their feelings and reflecting.
Right.
Be insightful by repeating what it is that they said so that they know that you actually, listen to what it is.
Right. Or even asking for clarification. Don't assume that you've gotten it. You sometimes have to say, ask for, what does that mean to you? I saw someone come up too, the facial expression. So body language is important too, kind of really tuning into the person. If you are in a hurry, if you're not really listening, you'll never get and understand what the person is really talking about. Great. All good answers. So one of the things you have to possess, and I touched upon this before, is realness. So being real is really being genuine. We want people to be genuine and really kind of be in the moment. So really caring about the person you're trying to help. And people know when you're dialing it in. If your head's someplace else, and this happens, you have a report to get out, you have 5 other problems to deal with, sometimes it's better to come back and say, I can't talk to you right now, or I will come back later today, or I will come back tomorrow. Because if you're not there for the person, if you're not really listening, people will know it. You can't fake it. The other thing is acceptance, trust, valuing the person, simply for who they are. And with the elderly person, I think that the best thing you can do is just value that they've gotten to this stage of life that they've had. And no one gets to be in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and even 100s now without going through a lot of change, having issues and problems. Nobody gets out of this life unscathed. So valuing that past knowledge that they've had, their past tribulations, even if someone's had a hard life and they've gotten to be 80 years old, wow, that's an accomplishment. Somehow they were resilient enough to get to be that age, and that's what you want to tap into. So valuing just because they are, and that they are also capable of making decisions and changes. And again, Sometimes it's not us that we have to worry about being able to do this, but people around us, our employees, also other workers coming in, and also family that want to take over for mom or dad or grandma and grandpa. And we have to, sometimes it's our role to say, no, they're really okay to make that decision. And again, unless there's some kind of impairment there, it's helping. Sometimes we have to help families to understand that grandma and grandpa can still make their own decisions. And maybe it's not what you want them to do, but it's what they want. And valuing the person should they not want to change. Not withdrawing our support because the person didn't do what we wanted them, or didn't become what we want them to become. So it's not like being on the playground where if you don't do what I say, I'm going to take my ball and go home. It's valuing that person when they don't do what you think is best for them. And you have to really sometimes dig deep within yourself to be able to do that. We need to build, it's easy to say build rapport and trust, but that only comes through repeated encounters, positive encounters. Trust is earned and not given. So people have to be able to know that you are a trustworthy person, perhaps with a secret or something they don't want anyone else to know. And again, as long as it's not threatening their life, other residents' life, the building, we have to be able to honor and build that trust and rapport with people. We have to have empathetic understanding, and again, we've talked about that. And empathetic understanding is non-judgmental. Easy to say, sometimes very, very hard to do. We are human. We have our own filters. We constantly judge people. We walk down the street and think, oh my God, what is she thinking wearing that dress? Or that woman is not, I wouldn't do that if I had that child. So we are constantly judging people, and we tend to look at the world as being correct from our own perspective. And somebody mentioned cultures previously, and this can go back to those understanding cultures or different ways of thinking. And again, easier said than done in many cases. And I've talked a little bit about why that might be. So we'll move on. So I want to get through everything. So empathy versus sympathy, and I've talked about the difference here again, but does anyone have any other thoughts about the difference between empathy and sympathy?
It was always explained to me that empathy is understanding the situation of the shoes that they are in, versus sympathy was giving them support.
Okay.
Emotional. One is, more, I view sympathy as being emotional versus empathy as understanding.
Okay. All right. That can work, but a lot of times we can still be emotional but empathetic at the same time. But I understand what you're saying. So sympathy is feeling sorry for the person, and empathy is trying to understand the point of view of the person. So sometimes we do feel sorry for the people that we're working with, but we can't let that get in the way of an empathetic relationship, of understanding the client from their point of view. And I want to just go back there, if I can get it to go back. That last one doesn't mean you have to agree. So you can be empathetic, but it doesn't mean that you agree with the person. Okay, just so that point comes across as well. So there's 7 decision-making steps in helping clients to make change: gathering the facts and data, making some assumptions perhaps about what needs to be done, and this I would say would be in work with the client, identifying the client's options, your options and the client's options, and it may be your options in terms of your job and what you can do for that person, and what rules they need to follow, using logic and common sense, incorporating your feelings or the client's feelings in all of this, and it's really listening to the client and how they're feeling about the impending change, helping the client to make the decision, modifying or changing the decision if needed. And that's the other thing that we need to let clients know is that usually most decisions that they make, can be alternatives. So if one thing doesn't work, we can try something else or we can modify it. Sometimes it's either or and there's no going back, but in many cases, it might be trial and error until we get to the place that they need to be and are comfortable at. And I'm kind of adding one more to this, again, listening to what the client wants, what the client thinks that they need, and what the client wants. I mentioned it before, but probably now is a good place to talk about the difference between need and want. Clients may need a certain change. They may need something from your perspective, but if they don't want it, if people don't own it and internalize it, they will never make that change, okay, unless they are forced to do something against their will. But clients really have to change their wants to be compatible with what the needs are. So many times what we need and what we want can be two different things. Okay, let's talk about ethics. What is ethics? It's a loaded question. So values,
Right versus wrong.
Right versus wrong, okay.
Well, morals.
Okay, so morals, all right. Right versus wrong. What else?
Moral obligation. Oh, boundaries about what is acceptable behavior.
Okay, boundaries, absolutely. So I think someone else says rules and regulations. So ethics is kind of, we know what it kind of is, but it's sometimes hard to say what it is. Ethics is usually equal to our moral philosophy. And here again, we think that everyone operates on this, or should operate on a certain standard that is absolute. But ethics, morality, it's always a moving target. There's no absolutes in this area, and that's the hard part. Generally, we talk about clarifying obligations when we talk about general ethics, and professional ethics are guidelines that direct practice behavior. Right? So most professions have some kind of ethical guidelines that this is what you are supposed to do. Someone mentioned boundaries. Certainly, we all have boundaries that we need to maintain with clients, with residents. How do we develop ethics and morality? And this is a subject that I could talk the whole hour and a half on if I get going on it. And there's a difference between ethics and morality. So ethics is a study concerned with the principles of human duty, looks at what ought to be, involves a rational assessment of a course of action, and looks for answers that are both right and thoughtfully reasoned. Morality is a behavior based on custom or tradition. It's a sense of right and wrong, and it gives us general rules of conduct. So usually morality is cultural, and we think about morality, again, there's no absolutes. Take Western culture, go back 50 years, 100 years. What was moral behavior, especially when we get into sexual mores and what is acceptable behavior in that regard, we see vastly different morals than we do today. Does it mean one is better than the other? No, it's just how society changed, although people would argue that perhaps things should not have changed. But morality collectively is constantly evolving in a society. what we think of as moral behavior is constantly a moving target. And we all kind of agree that this is moral behavior. Maybe not everyone in that particular community or society, but generally somewhere along the line we said this is moral behavior. Ethics really looks at how we make decisions, how we solve dilemmas, what we do in professional practice, and kind of the difference. So morality informs ethical practice. So values, what are they? What functions do they serve? And where do they come from? So I'm throwing those questions out to you.
So,
Alicia,
yep, how you are raised, values are passed down from family.
okay.
So what you believe are important.
All right.
What things that you believe that are important, in other words, are your values. They come from background, perhaps culture.
Yep. And collectively as a society, there's some, Christina just said society, and that's it. It's collectively as we move through, okay? Values are really meant to serve as guides or criteria for selecting good and desirable behaviors. A value is not just a preference, but it is a preference which is felt or considered justified. And I think we're getting some more comments, Alicia, if I can set it.
Values depict how you build and maintain relationships, and rules. Someone equates the values with rules.
Yes. So again, it's guidelines. Yes, someone is saying, Barbara's just saying now, guidelines of life. So the values are meant to guide our behavior. So we want, as a society, for everyone to have good and desirable behaviors, or social society breaks down. A value, again, though, is not just a preference, but it's a preference that is felt and justified, so that we have to have a reason for holding the certain values that we have. Value areas, we have values in education, how we look at money and possessions. We may have religious or moral values. We have values in helping others. We have values in friendships. There are certain values that we have for work and career, health, emotional and physical, love and affection, achievement, recognition, marriage and family, security, leisure. So our values really encompass all of our life. It's how we make decisions based upon our moral center, the values that we hold. And it's going to be different for everybody. And again, going back to being a change agent, you have to understand where someone's coming from and what they value, and realize that it may be different from what you value as well. So where do they come from? And folks have given us. So again, we get our values first of all, from our family, absolutely. Then we go, as we grow up, we move out further and we get them from our peer group. And sometimes our families are not too happy about the values that our peers are giving us. But we do develop our own values based upon our peer group. Our culture, media plays such a big role in our lives anymore that this is also where we get our values from, for good and for ill sometimes. But media really influences our culture more than in any other time. We have instant access. Religion can affect that. And I would also add here spirituality, because people can be spiritual and not religious per se, but that will impact their values. Our education also impacts our values. A lot of times people say that attending higher education may change how they see the world and therefore what they value. Politics also impacts our value system as well. And we can see the debate at a national level, that political divide between parties is based upon, at the core, what is valued most. So values influence ethical principles, which influence rules, which influence code, which influences our public policy and law. So as a society, again, we kind of move through things. You know, we value life. It's ethical. We move through. So by the time we get to the public policy, it's illegal to kill someone. So this is how we develop our rules for society. Ethical principles, how we move from values to behavior. And again, it comes from our values, and there must be in congruence with our values. So respect for person, beneficence and non-malfeasance. So when we talk about that in a professional way, beneficence means working towards something good, and non-malfeasance means basically doing no harm. So that has to be the underlying principle whenever we work with residents, with our clients, is that we are always looking to do good, and we are looking to not do harm to that person. Okay? Again, sounds easy. Sometimes we get into an ethical dilemma, and dilemmas in ethics mean that there's two things that are of equal value, either two good things or two bad things, and those are the choices that we need to make. But we try to keep that beneficence and non-malfeasance in the back of our mind, so that we're always working towards the good and not hurting anyone. We also have to look from a justice perspective. When we talk about public policy and laws, basically what we're talking about is concerned with protecting people against excessive or unfair power in terms of government or private people doing bad things to one another. So making referrals, and how does ethics kind of work with being this agent of change and helping people make change? Again, we have to understand what our own moral philosophy is. We have to practice from an ethical place. We have to look at helping people to be the best that they can be, trying not to do any harm to people because it might be the most expedient way to handle a problem. And really, another piece of this is knowing when to make referrals, knowing when you don't have the skills to help someone get the needed services, knowing when you don't possess the competency for effective services. You have to, how do you do this? You have to have a knowledge of the type and caliber of services available in the community, and the client must agree that the problem exists and be willing to work with the referral source. And sometimes that's where you would be coming in, is basically helping the client to eventually, maybe over time, realize that the problem exists.
Janet, I just actually had a thought. You know, when we're talking about policy and values, if you think about it, because the governor's budget, you know, some of those line items are basically motivated by what people in the public consider their values of,
Yep.
You know, what departments get funded, which get more money,
Right.
you know, versus something else.
Right, and not getting into a political discussion, try to avoid that at all costs, but that's absolutely right. And we vote for people based upon their values. When we have political campaigns, basically that's what we're judging people on, is what are their values and how does that resonate with me? And you're right, and then the policymakers use their own values then to make laws that we have to live with. But that's absolutely right. Informal, the part of this presentation is talking about informal and formal resources for working with people. So our informal resources are kind of naturally occurring. Neighbors, children, family members, our church groups, other community groups, yourself as apartment managers. Those are any person that the client comes into contact with on a regular basis that's not part of the formal system. And I think it's important, and sometimes we forget this as helping professionals because we have in our heads, here's what the formal resources are. But in many cases, the issues and problems, concerns can be solved if we just tap into informal supports for people. You know, what are their, you know, the neighbors can maybe help get Mary her groceries or take her to the doctor's appointment. So sometimes we don't need to tap into formal resources if there is a group around the person who can help. And usually the client is much more receptive to receiving help from informal rather than formal services. And sometimes, well, before I tell you what that is, let me go on a little bit here, but maybe a question to think about is, why do you think that people are able to accept help from informal services rather than when you hook them up with formal services? So think about that and give some answers to Alicia while I move on a little bit with this, and then we'll come back to that. So the advantages of informal resources from a strengths perspective, and if you remember last time, we talked about what the strengths perspective was, and the strengths perspective again is looking to see what that person has been able to do over the course of their life, what is good about that person, what is strong about that person, rather than just the deficits of that person. So when we look at informal resources, and again, Alicia, are you getting some responses?
I am, and they're very, very good. It's people that they're more comfortable with. You know, in an informal, maybe they have a history of positive associations, or one person says it doesn't seem so real, as in, you know, it needs a change. You know, they're comfortable, they're familiar, fewer bureaucratic hurdles.
Right.
You know, you don't have to go through a process or maybe fill out an application to do that,
right.
And they just basically feel more comfortable with the informal resource.
Right, and I think sometimes, and we'll talk about the slide I have up in a second, but the one point that you made, that one of the participants made, jogs something in my mind. I think that when we use informal resources, sometimes it may be denial, but we may be able to deny that we have a significant negative change in our life. Once you tap into a formal resource, then you kind of have to admit it to yourself. So sometimes, and that's okay. Sometimes if we can handle it through informal resources, it doesn't matter whether the person admits it a lot or not, as long as the change occurs. But that one comment kind of triggered that in my head. So the advantages of informal resources, you know, from the perspective of that older adult, is that they're more acceptable. We're all used to, at least hopefully, we're able to ask people for help. Sometimes it's harder for some people. Sometimes it's hard for us to accept help. But usually we ask people, can you do this for me, even if it's small things? So we're used to, and we have a pattern from all of our life of being able to do it. So it's comfortable for us. That may be because they have a pre-existing relationship. So again, not having to turn to that formal support, but hey, my friend can do this for me. So I've done things for that person in the past, and this is part of our friendship. Easily accessible. So that bureaucratic, not having to fill out paperwork, not having to disclose income. And as you probably all know, I don't need to probably tell that to any of your managers, asking people for income is really fraught with issues and problems. We're very protective of that in our society. And getting informal supports lacks the stigma of a handout, so getting something for nothing. Again, if you have an informal, you know, your friend, your family member, we expect those people to help us. So it's not a handout. It's something I would do for someone else myself. And sometimes it's cheaper and more cost effective. to be able to do that as well. So all good comments from you, and this is why it's sometimes easier to tap into those informal reports. The disadvantages of using informal resources, from the elderly person's perspective, and what I have run into, and I'm sure what all of you have run into, is they may not want to bother people. So they don't want to bother anyone in their existing social network. They don't want to bother caregivers. Oh, I don't want my son is working, he has a family, I don't want to bother him about that. I don't want to ask my sister to do that. There may be feelings of dependency. If they see themselves as being the matriarch or the patriarch in their family, and all of a sudden they're asking their children, their grandchildren to do things, then that's kind of, now I'm becoming dependent, and that's not my role in the family. So you have to understand how they see themselves within that family structure. And I'm getting one up here, Alicia, and there might be other ones, but they may feel like they're a burden. Absolutely. Absolutely. The elderly that we are working with right now do not want to be a burden to their children and to their friends. So that's a really big thing, and that goes also with pride. Pride goeth before the fall sometimes, but we have our own sense of who we are. And someone else, Deanna's saying pride is a big one, and someone else also said, I think, loss of control. Were there any others, Alicia, that came up that I couldn't see?
No, that was it. But, one that I've ran into it, and I'm sure others have, is sometimes the resident will not be so willing to go get help from like their son or their daughter because they're so afraid that their family member is going to perceive them as being weak and want to move them right out of the building instead of like connecting them with the services. And so they don't want to reach out because they're afraid that they're just going to take away all of their independence. And so they don't reach out to the family.
Yeah, and nursing home, that came up from Deanne too. That's really, really important. That was a great one, Alicia. We don't want people to see when we are vulnerable sometimes because we are afraid, and rightly so. And depending on the relationships that family members have with their loved ones, but at the next step, and people are so afraid of that loss of independence. And if we're going to talk about that more for the next session, but they're so afraid of that. But yeah, what will happen if I show that I am vulnerable? So a very important one as well. Great. Identifying those informal resources, and I'm not sure if anybody, just a quick, and you can let Alicia know, has anyone heard of ecomaps? Have any idea what an ecomap is? And you can just kind of chime in with yes or no as I continue to talk here. Ecomaps are really a great way of trying to figure out who is in the life of the clients that we serve. So ecomaps are kind of a visual map of family connections to the external world, and they provide a really useful tool for assessment of family, community, social relationships. And you get these by talking to people, and you probably could do one really easily if you think of a particular resident that you might have and you talk to them about this. So I'm getting the answers, and I think, Alicia, most people are saying that no, they have no idea what ecomaps are.
This is actually a new term for me, to be honest. It kind of reminds me of a family tree, sort of.
It is.
It's the same concept. Okay.
Yeah.
I think we all know family tree.
Right.
Yeah.
So what they do, an ecomap gives you a visual guide. It's a comprehensive picture of the family dynamics, relationships that are nurturing or that are conflictual, because not all relationships are good. So and as you know, as all the folks that are listening to me right now know, a person may have a ton of family, but is the family supportive? Do they get along with family? People have past history, so it's not always good relationships that people might have. It shows each individual family member's connections to the social support system. for example, housing support, income support, counseling, justice programs, the quality of these connections. Each individual family member's connections, I do have a slide that's coming up. I see Sandra at the bottom. I do have a slide, which will be coming up next.
Yeah, I was going to ask if there's like a template, because we are big on templates. We don't like to recreate the wheel. We like to take existing and maybe adjust it.
Let me show you this, and this is a very rudimentary one. This is kind of the elderly person would be in the center here, and what you would map out would be friends, adult children, church groups, other family, others, and then outside of that circle might be aging services such as transportation, personal care, Meals on Wheels. So in my attempts here, this is a very rudimentary eco map, but if people are interested, I will send to Alicia some links where you can see and get more information on this. But can you see my cursor moving around on the screen?
No.
Yes or no? Oh, okay. So I'll just do it through my voice here then. What you would want to do is, so the elderly person, and I've kind of made arrows to their relationships, but what you'd also want to do is a solid line would mean that there's solid relationships there. And adult children, you might want to map out all of the adult children, or sisters and brothers, or nieces and nephews, and have a dotted line would necessitate maybe that there was some issues or problems. So an eco map, in a very rudimentary sense, it gives us a visual picture of what the informal resources are and how strong they are. And again, what I can do, Alicia, is I can give you links to other resources online where people can get an idea. But we use these a lot in social work, in counseling, because sometimes when you're trying to figure out who's in the person's life, it's not just who, but how strongly they're connected. So solid lines when we do an eco map would be that there is solid support there. Broken lines would mean that there is issues and problems. And these can get quite large, actually. So again, this is a very rudimentary one just to kind of give you an example of what they might look like, but they're really good tools. So I'll provide you, Alicia, with a little bit more information, but it's a really good way to sit down with someone and kind of draw these out as you're talking to them. Tell me about who's in your world. Well, I have a son, Bob, but he hasn't spoken to me in 2 years. So that would be a tenuous relationship, and probably Bob would not be a good informal support. I think there was a comment, Alicia, if I'm...
Yes, one of our participants says, it sounds like a more evolved version of genograms.
Yep, it is. It is. And what you don't do usually in the genogram that you would do in an eco map is you are adding the formal, that line, that arrow, that solid arrow, is you are adding the formal supports as well. So what are they currently getting in? Transportation, Meals on Wheels, what other things that they need? And what you can visualize then is what they have going on in their life, and then maybe where the gaps are. So if they don't have anybody to take them to church, maybe it's calling that church up or religious organization and saying, is there somebody that can come and get Susie for church services? Or arranging for public transportation to do that, or some kind of transportation. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Get some feedback here. Okay, great. Okay, so what they help identify, again, is strong versus tenuous linkages, where the need for formal supports exist. And going back to the strong versus tenuous linkages, it just popped into my head. A lot of times when we see that someone has family, we automatically assume that family is going to be a help. And you probably have run into many cases where family is more of a hindrance than they are a help. So this makes it really good to kind of find out that information. good visual aid to help the elderly person visualize where supports exist and where they do not. And this can help them accept services. So if you show them and you say, yes, you told me that your son Bob, you have your son Bob, but I put a broken line here because he hasn't called you in 2 years. So maybe, you know, Susie was thinking, okay, Bob's going to come to my rescue now, and Bob doesn't want anything to do with Mom. And sometimes it's a hard pill to swallow, but seeing it in a visual format helps people to realize, oh, maybe I do need some more formal types of support. And I've used them a lot with clients, and it's been a big help. And just to get in my own head for the client who does what and where the gaps in services are. Okay, formal supports, which you all know about, but area agency on aging, local agencies, they may be subcontracted to the aging office or not. So every county kind of, the AAA office runs in a little bit different way. Some AAAs actually provide services out of their office. Many subcontract out to other aging services. The acquisition of formal supports, as you all know, depend upon how much the person can pay themselves. So can they pay privately or not, and the level of need. So the older, sicker, less resources person is supposed to move to the top. We all know that even with these formal supports, even for people who are very needy, very sick, they still may need to go on a waiting list for services. So in Pennsylvania, aging services, and we can touch more on these the next time, caregiver support, they offer employment services, health and wellness, help at home, and probably most of your participants and what you might be familiar with the mostly is this help at home, personal care, homemaking, adult day services, and that's still considered a community service, not an institutionalized service, housing, insurance, help with deciding what insurance and how to pick out different plans, meals, prescription assistance, protections and rights, so that's protective services, transportation services, just to kind of name a few. AARP is another resource that you can have, and that's primarily AARP's role is advocacy services. There's caregiving resources center. They talk about caregiving at home, planning and resources, and that event benefits insurance, legal and money matters, caring for yourself, providing care, senior housing, end-of-life care, grief and loss. If you haven't, and I'm assuming probably most of you know even more than I do at this point about these different options that AARP would offer, but if you haven't been on their website, it is a plethora of information, and it is a really good thing to keep bookmarked to go to as a quick resource, even to pull down things for family members to help them decide what might be the best course of action. And I know we're running out of time, so I just want to quickly talk a little bit about some research that my research partner and I have done in the last few years. And my research is primarily in the area of services to the elderly, so it's applied research. But we had a grant that we conducted in 2012, and my research partner is Dr. Heather Shanks McElroy from Keystone College, funded by the Center for Rural PA. And what they wanted us to look at was home and community-based alternatives to nursing home care. And this impacts you and your consumers in your housing projects and so forth. What the Center for Rural PA wanted to know was what's working and what's not working in rural areas of the Commonwealth. And some of this is also crossed over into urban areas as well. Really quickly, what we found, and if you're interested in this, you can email me or Alicia, and I will give her a link to the Center for Rural PA and the full report that we did for them. But what we found was that the strengths of our current provider system in Pennsylvania is that we have a lot of home-based care providers. There's 466, and they offer a wide range of services in Pennsylvania's rural counties. So that's the positive news. Some things that were not so positive is that 15 counties had no identifiable service providers, and an additional 12.5% of the counties had only one identifiable service provider. And that could mean that people were waiting longer to receive services or might not receive them at all. Rural elders and those under 60 with a disability had to be very significantly impaired in order to access the broad spectrum of services. So if you were someone who needed just assistance in a small area, and that small area, like personal care, would help you not to go into a nursing home, you may never get that care. And so you are going to probably decompensate faster, and so there's a higher risk that you may get institutionalized. We found that the funding model for services needs to be revised, that the geographic distance for elderly and disabled to travel to community-based services was great. So there may not be an adult daycare program in a convenient area for people in rural counties, and to put someone on a van and transport them for half hour, 40 minutes to an hour one way to access maybe an adult day services program, especially if they have dementia, is going to be very difficult for that person. And then there was a lack of competition among providers in rural areas, and a lack of competition meant that when someone is the only game in town, they may charge more for those services. The implications of this, and from your perspective, is basically planning ahead. And I think it's something that you need to maybe work with residents while they are well and get them to think about crisis planning before a crisis exists. Because if there is a lack of services and there is no plan in place, then it might fall on you and you're going to have a real mess on your hands. So planning before an acute hospitalization, helping clients to understand what is the client's wishes. And a lot of times we rely on family to do this, and the family are notorious for not wanting to think about mom and dad, grandma and grandpa dying or being really ill. They kind of push that off, and that's, again, human nature, but sometimes we need to precipitate that conversation. And if you know what the plan is, should a person need extra help, be hospitalized, can't come back to that residence, then it helps you to also be prepared. Looking at resources to help the person maintain the least restrictive environment, helping to eliminate some confusion and stress after a crisis, and it can help the elderly person and their family see a realistic picture of what resources may or not be available. So kind of the moral of the story is help families, help your residents plan for the inevitable, plan for a crisis state before the crisis happens. Okay, final thoughts. Empowering the elderly person. I can't say that enough. The bottom line is respect for the elderly person's desires and wishes, and their right to make their own decisions, and sometimes to make bad decisions, and then develop trust with the elderly person. I am done, and is there any questions or comments? I'd be happy. We have about a minute, I guess, Alicia, if there's any time left to answer anybody's questions.
I don't believe